Hello everyone and welcome to episode 28 of the Layton Fitness podcast. And in this episode we're discussing missing the forest for the trees. Now within the context of the fitness industry, I'm referring to individuals who focus on the minor details yet completely miss the bigger picture. And as a result they end up almost spinning their wheels by often working harder but for little to no results. And I've got 3 examples in particular I'm going to discuss here, and hopefully you can take a lot from this and start applying this. Now the first thing where people focus on the minor details and they miss the bigger picture is when people judge foods in isolation. In the sense, you'll hear people all the time, they'll say that food is good or that food is bad, yet they miss the bigger picture. So let me give you a quick example. Most people will probably argue that chicken and rice is a quote-unquote good meal. However, if you over-consume this during the course of the day, so let's just say, for example, for hypothetical sake, you had this just all day, and at the end of the day you were in a 2,000 calorie surplus. So ultimately you over-consumed this. Despite that food being quote-unquote perceived good, you're in a net caloric surplus at the end of the day. Therefore, you will gain body fat, regardless whether that food is considered good or bad. So this is probably the biggest misconception in the fitness industry. I see this all the time where people completely neglect total calories and macronutrients, and they just focus on whether that food is good or bad in isolation without even considering the rest of the day's caloric and macronutrient intake, that individual's goals, and what they've actually consumed the rest of the day. Now with that being said, even though I follow a flexible dieting approach with myself and my clients, which ultimately by default still requires that you have 80 to 90% of your food from quote-unquote whole food. Conversely, you could also have an individual who's in a net energy deficit, so they're already burning more calories than they're consuming, yet they have a small amount of processed food in moderation. If they're in a net energy deficit over a chronic period of time, they're going to lose tissue weight. So therefore this big misconception of this food is good, this food is bad, it just completely ignores context. And one thing you need to remember is the dose and the quantity of the food is ultimately sometimes more important than the food itself. So again, if you over-consumed rice and you're in a caloric surplus at the end of the day, you're going to gain body fat. Conversely, a small amount of quote-unquote processed food in moderation is not going to hinder your gains, with the caveat you're in a calorie-controlled diet. So it's more about taking into account the rest of the day's intake rather than just focusing on foods in isolation. Now, as I've discussed in some other podcasts, this doesn't just mean you just eat quote-unquote rubbish and you just fit those within your daily macronutrient calorie targets, because by default it's very difficult to hit a good macronutrient targets without mainly consuming the majority of food from whole, single ingredient whole foods. So I just wanted to make a little caveat here. The next point I want to make is people training to failure all of the time. So when I refer to the word failure, I'm talking about individuals that cannot get another repetition with any given weight. Now you see this all the time in pretty much every gym across the country and around the world, because people perceive that greater work ethic will result in better muscular gains, or I've heard terms from Arnold Schwarzenegger used to say muscle only grows because of the last few repetitions, and you need to go to failure on every set and beyond this. Yet the reality is we need to take a step back and look at the bigger picture. As we know, and I've discussed in several of my other podcasts, volume is one of the most primary influences for hypertrophy. As such, by going to failure on every single set, we can essentially impede total volume and therefore impede our program. Now, that's not to say that going to failure doesn't have its place. It absolutely does. We need to do it in moderation. So let me just give you a quick example. I've given this example so many times before. However, it's important that I illustrate my point. So say, for example, we've got an individual that does a bench press, and he's bench pressing 100 kilograms. Now let's just say, for example, in the first example A, he goes to failure on every single set. So we'll say the first set he gets 9 reps. Now because he goes to absolute failure on that first set, he's going to struggle to get as many repetitions in the second set. So let's just say, for example, he gets 6 reps on the second set. Again, he goes to absolute failure. Now on the third set, because he's so fatigued from going to failure on the first 2 sets, he's probably only going to get 5 repetitions. Conversely, example person B, who doesn't go to absolute failure on that first set, so let's just say he stops 1 rep shy of failure, so he gets 8 repetitions on that first set. The second set, because he doesn't go to failure on that first one, he's probably going to get 7 reps on that second set because he doesn't go to failure. Now the third set, he's probably going to get 7 reps again, and this time he goes to absolute failure. So in the second example, he went to failure on that last set, whereas example A went to failure on every single one. So example B, considerably more volume because they went to failure on that last set in comparison to what person A. So this is another great example of people missing the forest for the trees. They're focusing on the minor details, i.e. going to failure when they should be taking a step back and realising total volume is one of the key primary influences for hypertrophy, and therefore training to failure in moderation. Next, it's important just to distinguish the difference between going to failure on a compound lift compared to an isolation bicep curl. So it's different going to failure on, say, a squat than it is a bicep curl. As such, I recommend not going to failure until perhaps the last set of your big compound lifts, so your squats, your deadlifts, bench press, overhead press, and other pressing variations. Conversely, all your isolation moves, your lateral raises, your curls, etc., your tricep pushdowns, you pretty much go to failure on every single set. So again, we're still getting the benefits of going to failure, but we're using it in moderation. And we're also, as Eric Helms would say, not putting the cart before the horse, i.e. not sacrificing total volume to go to failure. Volume is our main primary influencer. Failure is important, but it's not as important. Therefore, it's used in moderation. So hopefully that makes sense. The next final point I wanted to discuss is a person who focuses on nutrient timing. Yet if you got asked them what was your total calorie and macronutrient intake consumed by the end of the day, they wouldn't have a clue. So they get obsessed with focusing on the minor detail of timing their nutrients, yet they don't focus on the biggest factors in terms of influencing body composition, so muscle gain or fat loss, i.e. the total calories and macronutrients met by the end of the day. So despite how well you've timed your pre and post exercise meal, if your macronutrients and calories aren't set up to you and your goals, you're not going to see progress. Now, I'm not saying that nutrient timing is completely irrelevant, it's definitely not. However, it's certainly more important within certain contexts. So I've discussed in so many other of my podcast episodes, if you're training twice a day, i.e. an endurance athlete, nutrient timing between session 1 and session 2 is very important because speed of glycogen resynthesis is very important prior to session 2. Conversely, an individual, like most people listening to this podcast, who train once per day, mainly just doing weight training, and your next session is over 24 hours away, glycogen resynthesis is going to take care of itself by default with the caveat you consume sufficient carbohydrates. And I've discussed this in detail in some other episodes, and that's not to say that you shouldn't be sandwiching a pre-exercise and post-exercise meal relatively close to the training bout, i.e. between 2 to 3 hours pre and post. However, we're not talking about minutes pre and post like you'll get some people reckon. So hopefully this has been informative, hopefully you've taken a lot from it, and hopefully you can start applying these 3 principles, because the biggest key with this, in my opinion, is not necessarily the improvement in results, because that will happen by default by following what I've just told you, but more just being less stressed. You'll notice with these 3 examples, for example, focusing on quote-unquote good or bad foods, it creates a bad relationship with food. It makes it very stressful going to social events, and ultimately you can be in a position where you don't have a life. In addition to the nutrient timing one, again, if you're stressed about fitting in your post-workout meal within 10 seconds of your workout or whatever it is, it just forces you to become an individual who doesn't really have a life. So that's the biggest key with it, and you can ultimately achieve better results by being less stressed and not focusing as much on these minor details. So thank you very much for listening. I look forward to speaking to you next week. If you're still yet to download my free ebook, How to Set Up a Nutrition Plan, or you want to learn more about me, some of my other content, please go to jameslayton.fitness.co.uk. Loads more content on there. Got a list of my services and my ebooks and my membership site as well, so it's worth taking a look. Okay, thank you very much. I will speak to you soon. Take care.